Hello guys, I am Panda Man. In 1876, the Canadian government under the leadership of its first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, passed the Indian Act. This legislation was a blueprint for controlling, administering, and assimilating Canada's indigenous population. Shortly after, the government established residential schools to christianise and civilise its indigenous citizens. The government funded the boarding schools and tasked various churches to run them. For over a century, 150,000 indigenous children were separated from their parents and placed in these education centers. Let us see these residential school survivors' dark stories.
My name is Roberta Hill. I'm from the Mohawk Nation, Grand River Territory. I'm a survivor of the Mohawk Institute Residential School. I was here as a student from 1957 to January 1961, and I came here with 6 of my family. So the whole institution itself was run by fear. So it was very regimented, more like a military style. You lined up for everything. You lined up for your meals, you lined up to go to school, you lined up to go to church. It was just like that, follow that routine. And you would be okay if you followed and didn't break the rules, you know, so you learn to follow the rules. All you see is this world around you. This is it. That was my world. I didn't learn about all those other things that were going on until my adult life. I didn't know there was all those other residential schools. I don't think anybody in Canada knew that much. So it was kept very secretive, and yet when you start to look at every residential school across Canada, you find the same thing. Residential schools are schools that were set up by the government of Canada, and there are other countries that have the same thing, but it was a policy that was put into place to bring as many Indigenous people as possible into these schools, to educate them into the European way of life, to take you away from your culture, your language, all your traditions, and that's what it's about. In order to sever those ties in your culture and your language, they had to separate children from families and communities. We wore uniforms, you all dressed the same, you had your hair cut the same, you were all one.
In 1922, a public official, Dr. Peter Bryce, was commissioned to study the health conditions in Canada's residential schools. He discovered that between 14% and 24% of students had died. The rate was much higher for toddlers. Today it is believed at least 6,000 children perished at Canada's residential schools. Some estimate that the total casualties could be 3 times that number.
I think it's very, very possible that children did die here, but we'll never know. It's just I've heard too many different stories for it to be all lies. If they're not buried here, they're probably buried somewhere on the property. And it's just one of those things that in time we may come across it. But this we can investigate. If there's any truth to it, if there's anything in there, just from the people that I know, from the survivors that I know, that say that, yeah, they remember this being something. And you don't just put a window at the bottom of a basement for no reason.
I left thinking that I'd come back one day and attack those people that attacked me. And they didn't just attack me, I think they attacked everybody. But I wrote a book called Dark Legacy, and ever since I wrote that book, I don't have this great desire to go back anymore and beat them up, eh? I haven't forgiven them, but they're not around to forgive.
When I realized the effect that this type of government administration had on thousands of people in my time, it disgusts me that I'm a Canadian, and I always thought Canada was the greatest country in the world. And I'm ashamed to say I'm Canadian because of what my government has done.
This is my friend Carol Cucci, whom I've known for a few years, and appreciate her friendship and what kind of things she can tell us about her First Nations.
So, having my father, my aunt, and my uncles gone to residential school. My father never discussed his upbringing. He was silent. The home that we lived in was silent around who he was and how he was raised. So prior to the age of 30, I had no idea or no understanding of what had happened to my family. And I knew that there was something up, like there was something wrong, but I didn't know what that was. When I was finding all of these things about residential school when I was 30, and my father had already passed away, my mother was still alive, and I started asking my aunt questions. I began to realize how strange everything was. And it began to see what those schools did and what the effect that we had and why my brothers and I had struggled so much with our emotional life. This was wrong. To take children away from their parents and herd them into a school against their will. It just blew me away. And then when you had the courage to stand up and say that this was wrong and that you knew it was wrong when it happened, instead of standing up and said, I witnessed this and it didn't look that bad.
In the 1980s, Indigenous people began to speak out publicly about their experiences of abuse. Survivors launched a class action lawsuit against the government. As part of that case, the Canadian government launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008. The commission traveled the country for 6 years, hearing testimony from nearly 7,000 witnesses as part of their mandate to document this history of abuse.
I had a hearing problem. I was mocked. I was teased. I was picked on.
Sometimes I felt that I can't function. I was hurting so bad inside. But on the outside, especially for my children, I tried to be strong.
Before anything happened to me, I want to apologize to my family for what I put them through. I could tell my grandchildren, I could tell my great-grandchildren that I love them.
I sincerely advise candidates to face up to your dark history and compensate these victims who have been hurt and abused.